Somewhere, deep in the Ozark woods, lurks the two people everyone tries to avoid the most. If you're not careful, they may find you before you find them.
Good morning, guys. It's 10:30 a.m., January 5th, 2022. Grandma's still in bed sleeping. She should be getting up here pretty soon, I think. But I'm about to watch the Fire of Learning. This is the mysterious history of cinnamon. We've already done a couple of videos off of this young man's channel, I believe. We did the horse manure and I think pineapples, and I know we did sweet potatoes, I believe. Anyway, so I think we've done 3, and now this will be number 4, the mysterious history of cinnamon.
From its presence in drinks, to foods, to desserts, to holding a spoonful of it in your mouth for some sort of ungodly entertainment, there are so many uses for this alluring spice that it would be a challenge to list them all out. But what?
I don't know that I could put a mouthful of cinnamon. No. Couldn't do it. No.
What is cinnamon? How is it made, where did it come from, and how did it become so popular in cuisines around the world? Believe it or not, the story of cinnamon is quite a tale, with origins stretching back to very ancient times, to an age when its source and production was a mysterious, well-kept secret. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning's Food History Series, a series in which we explore the surprisingly amazing origins of the food we eat every day. Thank you for joining us in today's episode as we look at the origins of cinnamon. Where does cinnamon come from? For millennia, this was kept secret from outsiders, namely those of the Middle East and Mediterranean. It is first recorded in Egypt as far back as 2000 BC, though again, no one knew where it came from, only that it came from somewhere south or east. Information about cinnamon from pharaonic Egypt is a bit vague, although it's clear from writing and archaeology that it had a number of uses apart from consumption. For example, it was used as a medicine, and was said to have an ability to aid in things like digestive issues and the treatment of ulcers. Cinnamon was also an ingredient involved in embalming mummies. In fact, some Egyptologists have commented that the faint smell of cinnamon is still present on certain remains to this day. Cinnamon was expensive and highly valued in ancient Egypt, frequently used as an offering to the gods from the pharaohs, an example being a record of an offering made by Ramses III in the 12th century BC. Rulers like Hatshepsut would look for the homeland of cinnamon, but would not find it. The importance of cinnamon would continue throughout the centuries, into the age of Ptolemaic Egypt in the 4th century BC. Slightly before this, in the 600s BC, cinnamon had reached the ancient Greeks. It also reached the Israelites around this time as well, as is evidenced by cinnamon's presence in the Bible, known to the Hebrews as konomen. It would have a similar value and similar purposes for these cultures as well. For example, there is an ancient Greek inscription that describes a donation of cinnamon to the god Apollo, and records of a perfume which included it called megaleion. There is evidence that the Greeks, Egyptians, and other Mediterranean cultures of this time distinguished between the two main types of cinnamon that they encountered. These are true cinnamon and cassia cinnamon. We now know that these came from 2 separate locations. These locations, however, still remained unknown to these Mediterranean cultures even by this point. Because of this, fantastical tales developed and spread surrounding cinnamon and its origins. Authors like Herodotus and Aristotle recorded these tales. They tell of a giant bird which lived in Arabia, known as the Cynomogolus. The Cynomogolus was said to make nests atop cliffs and high trees out of cinnamon sticks acquired from distant lands. They claimed that the people of Arabia acquired the spice with clever trickery. They would leave out a copious amount of meat for the Cynomogoluses. The birds would fly down to take it, and would ultimately take too much. The nests would then fall from the excess weight, and the men would run to claim the sticks. It was also said that cassia grew around marshes, and was protected by, quote, a frightful kind of bat armed with claws, and winged serpents as well, end quote. The Romans, who sometimes enjoyed cinnamon-flavored wine, knew no better than the Greeks where the spice came from, and so the myths associated with it passed to them from the Greeks. Not everyone was convinced, however. Pliny the Elder, who lived in the 1st century AD, wrote in his Natural History that these were likely just stories that merchants made up to increase prices. He was probably right. The whole point of keeping its source a secret was to guard a valuable monopoly. And it was a trick that worked, too. According to him, about 12 ounces of cinnamon in his day was worth the equivalent of 4 years' worth of wages for the average Roman laborer. It seems that this price had lowered substantially by the 4th century, according to the Emperor Diocletian's famous edict on maximum prices, but it would remain fairly expensive compared to today's standards for centuries to come. Pliny devotes several pages to the discussion of cinnamomum and cassia. He tells of how the emperor under whom he lived, Vespasian, made offerings of cinnamon to the gods, and asserts that while cinnamon and cassia arrive from the Arabian Sea, they do not come from Arabia itself. He instead asserts that they must come from Ethiopia. Indeed, Arab merchants also claimed that it came from Africa, likely to steer explorers in the wrong direction. Ethiopia was indeed a stop along certain trade routes, but not the origin. The reality is that cinnamon and cassia originated in southern and southeastern Asia. The island of Sri Lanka, the teardrop of India, historically called Ceylon, was home to true cinnamon. Meanwhile, the cassia of this age came from southern China. As mentioned, true Ceylon cinnamon and cassia cinnamon, which both come from plants of the same genus, are a bit different, but overall very similar and difficult to distinguish. Thus, even today, cassia is just labeled as cinnamon in places like the United States. Austronesian sailors from modern-day Indonesia likely played a major role in growing it and in its initial transportation. Cinnamon is made from the bark of evergreen cinnamon trees. Once the trees reach an appropriate size...
See, I had heard, I think my grandfather, his grandma or granddad Ice, one of them, told me that the cinnamon that we have in the United States isn't true cinnamon. So I don't know that, and it sounds like that may be true.
They are cut, and the outer skin of the bark is peeled off. The inner bark is where one gets the cinnamon. It is beaten and then carefully stripped off the log. These thin rolls of inner bark are then left to dry. They are then cut for sale and can be sold in stick form or ground up into a powdery form. Europeans would not realize these things for some time, however, and the classical myths and ambiguity surrounding the origin of cinnamon would persist throughout much of the Middle Ages. Even by the time of the Crusades, there are records of medieval scholars claiming that cinnamon was obtained from the waters of the source of the Nile with fishing nets. Like the ancient Egyptians, medieval Europeans would use cinnamon for food, for both taste and preservation,
Amazing
and
what
also
people
as a
come up
medicine
with.
for minor ailments like a sore throat. In 1292, Giovanni da Montecorvino, an Italian missionary, wrote of his travels to India and other parts of Asia. He became the first European to write of the origins of cinnamon, writing, quote, "The cinnamon tree is of a medium bulk, not very high, and in trunk, bark, and foliage is like the laurel. Indeed, altogether it resembleth the laurel greatly in appearance. Great store of it is carried forth of the island, which is hard by Maabar." End quote. For much of the Middle Ages, the Venetians held a strong grip on trade in the Mediterranean and thus were a very important middleman in the spice trade, which of course included cinnamon. However, in the 15th century, the trade routes of Asia became more difficult for Europeans to access due to the rising power of the hostile Ottoman Empire. As a result, Europeans began to seek out alternate routes to Asia to acquire the goods of the East. Among them, spices like cinnamon. The Portuguese succeeded first by going around Africa, followed by the Spanish who sailed west, discovering the Americas as a consequence. As the early modern era began, the Portuguese colonized Sri Lanka and other parts of Asia, enslaving many natives to grow cinnamon. Meanwhile, the Spanish colonized the Philippines, where cassia was grown. Thus, the Europeans, Portugal in particular, had gained direct access to cinnamon and became very wealthy for having done so. However, other European powers would soon take an interest in getting their hands on the spice trade and the money that came with it as well. Cinnamon trees are, of course, a tropical and subtropical plant, requiring years of warmth and moisture to produce its desired bark. As the centuries passed, they would be planted in other suitable European colonies, but growing and mass-producing cinnamon in Europe itself was not feasible. Thus, these European powers sought to control the areas where it could be done. European domination of South and Southeastern Asia would follow a pattern similar to the Americas. The Spanish and Portuguese would lead the way. Then, the Dutch would force their way in. The Dutch began colonizing Ceylon in 1638 and would expel the Portuguese totally 20 years later, colonizing many parts of the island. Both powers would retain colonies on other islands of southeastern Asia, but Ceylon had by this point acquired a reputation for producing the very best cinnamon which Europeans sought most, a reputation which, in truth, Ceylon cinnamon still has. The Dutch East India Company then became a leader in the cinnamon trade. Naturally, the Dutch became very protective of their colonies and the highly profitable cinnamon they produced. In 1659, they passed a law stating that selling wild jungle cinnamon outside of the mandate of the Dutch East India Company was punishable by death. The Dutch even deliberately burned some of their supply to keep prices in Europe high. It was so important that cinnamon bundles can even be seen on the Dutch Ceylon colony's coat of arms. Gradually, however, Britain and France came to dominate European colonial efforts and entered into competition with each other. By the early 19th century, Britain came out on top and would take Sri Lanka from the Dutch in 1796. Gradually, the British would come to dominate all of India. By this point, however, cassia cinnamon had caught on more in Europe. Furthermore, men like the French botanist Pierre Poivre had helped to break the Dutch monopoly on spices like cinnamon by smuggling plants from the Dutch Spice Islands in the 1770s. The French then began to grow it in places like the Caribbean. As the 19th century progressed, cinnamon would go from a luxury spice of the very wealthy to one increasingly used by the common man. It was featured more and more frequently in things like recipe books as the centuries passed as a result, until eventually it could be found on the spice racks of most homes in many countries around the world. Today, 99% of the 225,000 tons of cinnamon produced each year is produced by just 4 countries. Indonesia leads the way at 87,000 tons, followed by Vietnam, China, and Sri Lanka. The way in which cinnamon is produced has remained largely unchanged for the past 1,000 years. Today, however, when you go to your local supermarket, you are much more likely to buy a kind of cassia than Ceylon cinnamon, especially in the United States, where Chinese cassia is predominant. Cassia cinnamon is easier and cheaper to produce, although scientists state that Ceylon cinnamon is actually a bit healthier. The belief that cinnamon can be used as a natural medicine for various ailments has continued from ancient Egypt up to the modern age. Today, it is sometimes used by individuals suffering from things like diabetes, but in truth, science has yet to actually prove its benefits in treating these disorders. And so there we have it.
Well, there we go, guys. I didn't have a whole lot of commentary on that one because there wasn't a whole lot that I knew beyond the fact that there was 2 different kinds of cinnamon, but I didn't remember where they came from, to be honest with you. So we both learned something on this one. So good deal, good deal. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. I'm going to go check on Grandma. I think I hear her moving around, not sure. We'll get some more posts. Let us know what you think about our new format, and help Grandma out in getting our F650. Hit the like and subscribe button, share our videos with your friends and your family, and remember, enjoy how bad it is today because it'll be worse tomorrow. Love y'all.